The title of Inocracy 2020 is Bringing the Future Back to Democracy. And in theory, who would be better suited for this task than the generations to come, than future generations? In practice, however, the problem is quite obvious. They have not been born yet. They don't have a voice. They cannot speak up. What we want to do in this session, however, is to discuss ways on how we can involve them in decision-making today anyways. But let me say that it feels a bit peculiar to talk about the rights and needs of people that have not even been born yet when we are in the middle of a crisis. The global pandemic we are currently in has shifted our attention very much to the here and now. And I think rightly so. Our task is to protect those that are hit hardest by the virus and to stand in solidarity to keep infections low. However, it is not only today or the next 2 months or the next 3 years that matter. History has shown us that crises can be very important windows of opportunity for long-term political pathmaking. Take the example of the European Union, which rose from the ruins of World War II. If the decision makers at that time had not been wise enough to stand for the idea of a unified Europe, which had to be a utopian idea at the time, we would live in a very different world now. And we would be much less resilient in dealing with the current crisis. I think what this shows us is that even in times of crisis, or maybe especially in times of crisis, it is vital that we take decisions taking into considerations the rights and needs of our future societies and of generations to come. And this will be the focus of the session today here, titled Overcoming Democracy's Present Bias, How to Involve Future Generations in Today's Policymaking. I'm very glad that we have 3 speakers here with us for this session who are at the forefront when it comes to long-termism and protecting future generations. I would like to welcome with us here Roman Krznaric. Roman is a public philosopher and author of the book The Good Ancestor, How to Think Long-Term in a Short-Term World, which I can only recommend. I'd also like to welcome with us Tatsuyoshi Sahijo. He's the founding director of the Research Institute for Future Design in Tokyo. I'm sure you are all familiar with the concept of citizen councils, where randomly selected citizens deliberate on certain policy issues. In Professor Sahijo's work, it is actually not only present citizens that deliberate, but also imaginative future citizens. We will talk about this in more detail later. And last but not least, I'm very excited to also welcome here with us Sophie Howe. She has a very unique role. She's the first Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. Roman will start us off now with the keynote on why we have to act and think more long-term and how we can manage to do this. And then after that, we will give you at home some time to meet other participants of our conference and to engage in a discussion on Roman's input in a 15-minute breakout session. And after that, we will meet back here and get Sophie and Tatsuyoshi involved in the debate. Roman, the floor is all yours.
Thanks for that introduction. And let me start with a story, really, which is that at the end of last year, during the time of the UK general election, my partner and I decided to give our children an unusual birthday present. We decided to give them our votes. So we all sat around the kitchen table and debated the party manifestos, and they then each told us where to put the X on the ballot sheet. And in case you're wondering, no, they didn't simply follow their parents' political opinions. Now, why did we do this? We did it because we live in an age of pathological short-termism that systematically ignores the interests of the generation upon generation of children who will inhabit the future. We know our politicians can barely see beyond the next election or the latest tweet. Markets spike, then crash in speculative bubbles. Nations sit around international conference tables focused on their near-term interests while the planet burns and species disappear. Many governments have absolutely failed to plan long-term for pandemics. Countries like Taiwan that had pandemic plans in place have dealt with the virus most effectively. And we know that on the level of individuals, we are constantly looking at our phones and clicking the buy now button. This is the age of the tyranny of the now. And the way I think about this is that I believe that humankind has colonized the future. In wealthy countries especially, we treat the future like a distant colonial outpost where we can freely dump ecological degradation and technological risk as if there was nobody there. And the tragedy is that tomorrow's generations aren't here to challenge this pillaging of their inheritance. They can't throw themselves in front of the can you just take the slide back, please? They can't throw themselves in front of the king's horse like a suffragette, or stage a sit-in like a civil rights activist, or go on a salt march to defy their colonial oppressors like Mahatma Gandhi. They're given no rights or representation. They have no influence in the marketplace. Now, to grasp the scale of this tragedy, have a look at that image there, the scale of unborn generations. In the green circle, there are 7.7 billion people who are alive today. And over the past 50,000 years, an estimated nearly 100 billion people have lived and died. But both of these are far outweighed by the nearly 7 trillion people who will be born over the next 50,000 years, assuming current birth rates stabilize. Meaning the next 2 centuries alone, tens of billions of people will be born. Amongst them, all your grandchildren and their grandchildren and the friends and communities on whom they will depend. So how will all these future generations look back on us and the legacies we're leaving for them? Well, you know, a lot of people say that, can we just switch to the next slide, please? A lot of people say that, well, we don't have the competence to think long term and take into account those future generations. But over the past 5,000 years, human beings have engaged in what's known as cathedral thinking. That is planning, engaging in projects with time horizons lasting decades and sometimes centuries. They go from the realm of public policy and infrastructure to scientific and cultural projects too. And let me just give you some examples of these. The next slide, please. So for example, you can see in the top left-hand corner there, Ulm Minster in southwest Germany, a classic cathedral thinking project. It was begun in 1377 when the citizens of Ulm decided they wanted their own religious building. They'd finance it themselves. Well, it wasn't finished for nearly 500 years until 1890. That was an extraordinary long-term thinking project. They knew it wouldn't be finished in their lifetimes. They embarked on it anyway. On the right-hand side, you can see the sewers built in London in the Victorian period after the famous Great Stink of 1858, when the raw sewage was being dumped in the Thames, tens of thousands of people dying each year from cholera and other diseases. And after the stench, the smell was so bad after 1858 that finally members of Parliament passed the emergency legislation to build the sewers over the next 19 years. And the chief engineer, Sir Joseph Bazalgette, built those sewers so they were twice as big as they needed to be. And that's why they are still in use today. That was cathedral thinking. You might call it sewer thinking as well. In the bottom left-hand corner, you can see the suffragettes campaigning for women's rights, another cathedral thinking struggle begun in 1867 when the first suffragette organization was formed in Manchester. They didn't achieve their aim of votes for women for at least 50 years. So there's a lot of inspiring long-term thinking projects around. But let's not be too mythological about this. Let's remember cathedral thinking isn't always good for us. It can be put towards narrow and self-serving ends. So the regime in North Korea, for example, wants to preserve its power and privilege from generation to generation, giving it to family members. That's a kind of cathedral thinking. Or think in the corporate world. A former head of the investment bank Goldman Sachs once said, "We're greedy, but long-term greedy, not short-term greedy." Well, that's a very narrow form of cathedral thinking. So I think we need to broaden our vision. And we need to consider how we can actually make democracy itself more long term, have more of that cathedral thinking attitude? How do we create deep democracy that takes into account the interests of future people, future citizens? Well, I want to talk about 4 different ways we can do this. The idea of guardians of the future, citizen assemblies, intergenerational rights, and self-governing city-states. Now, the first approach, the idea of a guardian of the future, is a political position where the remit is specifically to represent and safeguard the interests of future generations. So Israel, for example, has had in the past an ombudsman for future generations, and so has Hungary. And one of the great guardians of the future we've got around today, you're about to hear from, that's Sophie Howe, the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, whose remit is to to look at policy impacts on future citizens. And that her position, I think of her as one of the great time rebels of our age, and the idea of the Future Generations Commissioner is spreading around the world. But I don't want to say more about that. You're going to hear from Sophie about that. The second kind is the idea of citizens' assemblies, participatory democracy. And there is an explosion of citizen assembly movements around the world in the last few years. You've seen them in action in Ireland, in Spain, in Belgium, in Canada. And what's really important about them is the growing research showing that citizen assemblies taking random members of the public to deliberate on public policy issues, a bit like the ancient Greeks did, they tend to have much longer term vision than your regular representative politicians, partly because they're not caught in those short-term cycles of elections or being beholden to corporate interests. And also they tend to represent a variety of interests and therefore a variety of different visions of the future because they have people from different social backgrounds. And I think one of the most exciting citizen-based form of long-term thinking that we're seeing around today is also something you're going to hear from today, which is the future design movement in Japan. And I'm just going to show this one image from future design. And as Professor Tatsuyoshi Saijo will explain to you, one of the things they do in future design, which is about making long-term decisions at the town and city level, but also other levels, is that they get members from the public to wear these almost ceremonial robes that you can see there, imagining themselves as residents from 2060 or 2080. And when they do so, they come up with much more transformative plans for their towns and cities. They use their imaginations to stretch democracy forward in time. Now, a third approach is the idea of granting legal rights to future generations. So in the United States, there is a pioneering public interest law firm called Our Children's Trust that has filed a groundbreaking legal case against the US federal government on behalf of 21 young people campaigning for the legal right to a safe climate and healthy atmosphere for both current and future generations. You can see the 21 of them there. They're called the Juliana 21. They filed legal cases also at the state level. And this is a David versus Goliath struggle. But they have already influenced groundbreaking lawsuits worldwide for future generations' rights, from the Urgenda case in the Netherlands you may have heard about to other cases in Colombia, in Uganda and other countries as well. And alongside these legal struggles for future generation rights, which in a way I think are some of the most significant struggles for human rights since the French Revolution, you know, rights for people who aren't even born. This is new, this is extraordinary. We're also seeing the struggle of rights for nature itself. So in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Wanganui River has been given legal rights, or the Ganges and Yamuna rivers in India. And a fourth approach to deepening democracy is the idea of empowering cities to make more decisions. Because what we've seen throughout history is that cities are very good at taking the long view. So think back to ancient Rome, the way that the earliest cities in Western civilization had long-term vision through putting in place public infrastructure like sanitation and water systems. And we can see the long view in operation in cities today. When President Trump withdrew from the Paris Accord in 2017, 279 US city mayors said, no, we are going to commit to staying with the Paris Agreement and below 1.5 degrees. They represented nearly 1 in 5 Americans from major cities like Miami and Boston, millions and millions of people. So cities are really good at taking the long view. And the image you can see there, I've done an image from my book, The Good Ancestor, of reimagining Europe as city-states. Now, I'm not saying we should be getting rid of Europe. I love the European Union, but I'd like to see cities being given more power. In a way, I'd like to see the development of interdependent networks of cities, a bit like the Hanseatic League in the 15th, 16th century. We're seeing this today with the C40 cities, 90 cities committed to climate change. And you're seeing innovation from cities coming out of COVID-19. So, for example, Amsterdam has adopted the British economist Kate Raworth's model of donut economics as part of its post-COVID recovery program. That's a long-term vision about circular economy, decarbonizing the economy, getting off economic growth. And we need more of that today. So those are 4 ways to deepen democracy. But something else we need to do, which is we need to hold governments to account for their long-term public policy. The image you see there comes from my book, where I have highlighted, I think, what is the best quantitative index of long-term public policy, called the Intergenerational Solidarity Index. It takes 10 different measures in economic, social, and ecological fields and puts them together into a single number that ranks 122 countries on their long-term policy practice. Some of the measures are things like the amount of renewable energy in the national energy system, or long-term investment in healthcare and education, or also degrees of wealth inequality and economic measure, puts them together in a single number. You can see the top 24 ranked countries out of the 122 there. You've got Iceland and Sweden near the top, but actually many non-OECD countries as well. Countries like Nepal, countries like Costa Rica, countries like Sri Lanka. You'll notice, of course, that China isn't there. China's only number 25. Germany isn't there. Germany's only number 28. Britain's down at 45. The US is number 62. So I think we should be holding governments to account for their performance on an index like the Intergenerational Solidarity Index. But something people often say to me, they say, look, forget this idea of trying to reinvent democracy for the long term, redesign it for the long term. Why don't we just get benign dictators, enlightened despots to help us? Why don't we become more like China, that has all that long-term investment in green energy? Why don't we become more like Singapore, which might limit political and social rights, but at the same, they limit political and civil rights, but they have long-term investment in public housing or education? Well, that's an interesting question. Are authoritarian governments actually better at long-term thinking and long-term policy? Well, I decided to look at the evidence of this in my book, and there you can see a scatter graph that along the x-axis on the bottom is the Intergenerational Solidarity Index scores from 0 up to 100, and on the y-axis going up is a measure of democracy called the V-Dem Liberal Democracy Measure from the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. And what we see is a line going upwards like this. What it means is that the more democratic a country, it is, the better its long-term public policy performance. The line goes upwards. And if you look at the top 25 scoring countries on the Intergenerational Solidarity Index, 21 of them are democracies. And of the 25 bottom scoring countries on the index, 21 of them are authoritarian governments. So if we stand back and look at all of that, just in conclusion, what I'd like to say is that the idea that benign dictators can help us, can we just get off that slide, please? Thanks. The idea that benign dictators can help us is not a solution to democracy or our political problems in the long term. We need to deepen democracy in the 4 ways that I have been talking about: guardians of the future, intergenerational rights, citizen assembly movements, devolving power to cities. I think if we do that, we will be able to, in a way, become the good ancestors that future generations deserve. We can learn, as Paul said in the beginning, from crises through history. Out of the crises of the Second World War came extraordinary long-term institutions: the European Union, the World Health Organization, the National Health Service in Britain, where I live. And I believe that we need to be taking this opportunity now to take democracy into the long term. I used to be a political scientist. It never occurred to me at that time that we disenfranchise future generations in the same way that women and other groups have been disenfranchised in the past. It is time for that to end. We must give a voice to the citizens of tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Roman. I think this was truly an insightful talk. This word is used a lot to describe keynotes, but in this case, I think it's more than true. Thanks a lot for this. Before we'll start discussing your ideas with Sophie and Tatsuyoshi, We will now go into the breakout groups and give everybody in front of the screen, our participants, the chance to discuss what you just heard from Roman. Maybe you want to discuss if you also want to pass on your voting rights to your children. But the guiding question we want to give you to discuss now is, after hearing Roman's input, do you think about the future differently? And if so, in what way? We will be back here in 15 minutes and then get Sophie and Tatsuyoshi involved in the debate. See you in a bit. Hi everybody, welcome back. I hope you had a good breakout session and a good discussion. We will now start with the reflection, and I want to invite you to pose questions that came up during the breakout session or are coming to your mind now into the Zoom chat, and I will then bring them into the debate later on. But now I would like to give the word to Roman, because Roman, we have two people here with us, Sophie and Yoshi, who put your ideas into practice, and I'm sure you have a lot of questions to ask them and are very curious about your work. So please go ahead, Roman.
Well, it's really exciting for me to have Sophie Howe and Yoshi Saijo here, because they are two of my great heroes when it comes to long-term democratic innovation, and their work is genuinely of historic importance, I believe. And I just want to ask them a few questions. We're going to have a bit of a conversation before we do a bit of Q&A, but let me begin with Sophie. Sophie, can you just tell us, what exactly does a Future Generations Commissioner do? And can you give some examples of how you've used your influence and powers on behalf of future generations?
So I guess the first thing to say is that my position is established in law. So it's not just a kind of a policy appointment or a public appointment in the normal sense, I suppose. It was established through the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which is a law passed by our Welsh Parliament, which requires all of our public institutions, including our government in Wales, to demonstrate how they're taking decisions in a way which meet today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And then my job title, I guess, or job description as set out in law, is to act as the guardian of the interests of the future generations of Wales. So how do I go about doing that? And of course, this debate around how can one person or indeed an institution really represent the views of those yet to be born? I mean, they don't talk to me an awful lot, those who are yet to be born. They don't tell me exactly what it is that they want me to lobby for and advocate on their behalf for. So, but I think that really the power of having an independent institution, so I'm not a political appointment, I'm independent of government. My role is to both advise and support the government on the way in which they go about taking policies in the long term, and also to monitor and assess the progress they're making in doing that against our 7 national long-term well-being goals. And how does that sort of work in practice? Well, I suppose there's a number of examples where I've challenged the decision making that the government is taking forward. So one particular example, the government wanted to spend £1.5 billion on constructing a new section of motorway, and it was going to go through a nature reserve, and a whole range of issues with that. And so I asked them, please explain to me, how does that meet our long-term carbon emissions targets, when actually what we need to do is take people off the roads and get them onto public transport and active travel? How does that meet our long-term goal of a healthier Wales, when what we don't want is people sitting in their cars? We want them walking, cycling. We want to be tackling our obesity crisis. How is that going to meet our long-term goal to enhance, maintain and restore nature and biodiversity when you're taking this through a nature reserve? And then even if we think about the financial implications, not only is it highly questionable that this is at all in the interest of future generations, in fact, I would say it's absolutely not in the future generations, the interest of future generations, but they were going to use borrowing powers to build this road. So not only were they going to be doing something that was bad for future generations, they were going to be saddling them with the bill for it, which they would be paying off over a number of years. And Prior to my intervention, it had been seen as a done deal. This was going to happen. My intervention, I suppose, shamed the government. You've passed this law. You've said these are your long-term goals and aspirations. Now you have to take decisions in that way. And if you don't, I will be calling you out on behalf of our future generations. They changed their decision, and we're now investing in public transport instead.
And can I just a little follow up there, because you used the word shame, which is really interesting, because what it tells us something kind of interesting, I think, that, tell me if I'm right or wrong about this, but in terms of formal powers, you probably don't have that much actual formal power to punish governments, for example, but it's more a kind of a more of a soft power. Or would you say that, do you need more power? How would you describe the powers that you actually have?
So I would describe them as name and shame powers. So I can't force anyone to do anything or stop anyone doing anything. But the power is in having that voice speaking out on behalf of future generations and calling out the government and other decision makers in terms of what they're doing and whether they are in the interests of future generations. And of course, that power is added to when we see things like the youth climate strikes, when we see some of the big political debates that are happening at the moment regarding COVID, regarding Brexit, all of these things that are going on in the UK, and this growing sense of momentum and passion around governments really acting in the long term and taking into account the views of future generations. So that's power to my elbow. In terms of more powers, I think that I would like some commissioners, Children's Commissioner and the Equality and Human Rights Commission, for example, do have powers of injunction, for example, to stop people doing things, and maybe those should be powers to come. But so far, I think we've been quite successful in changing the narrative of a number of decisions that are taken in the interests of future generations and balancing them with current needs.
Brilliant, thanks. Now let's just switch over to Yoshi, because there's a very different model that you've been working on in Japan, I think over the last 5 years, which is, less having a particular political position about future generations and in a way empowering local people to imagine their own future. So can you describe for us what a future design session looks like? What actually happens? Give us a bit of a picture of this methodology that you've been developing.
Yeah, and when we started out our future design session in a small town in Harvard, 2015, we divided 5 or 6 people in the four groups of 5 or 4 people, and 2 groups are current generation. They're supposed to talking about 2060 because at that time, the Japanese government asked them to please make 2060 plan. The other 2 groups, they're supposed to be imaginary future people. So meaning that we asked them, please get on time machine. You guys can go to 2060 without changing your age. Then please think about 2060. Then please create some policies for 2020 people. And funny thing had happened, and the people who belong to current generation, they started creating a kind of thing, and we are short of elderly people, the care facilities. We will make more elderly people care facilities. However, imagine future people, they are so creative. They are thinking about future people's well-being. And one famous example is that in that town, they do have a very small mountain called Nansho Mountain. Nansho Mountain was so famous because of the Kenji Miyadawa's story. Kenji Miyadawa is a very famous writer. He created a very nice story of friendship. At the top of the mountain, there used to be Galaxy train station there. However, Nansho Mountain has been damaged by the flood. And are there any nicer way to make the mountain, for example, natural park? Everybody can go there. So the story of the narratives are totally different. And surprisingly enough, town mayor has been seeing both of them. Wow, once people become imaginary future people, they can create so many nice ideas for future generation. Then town mayor create future strategy division in the town. People belong to there, they're supposed to be behaving like a kind of the imaginary future people. Then they can create many nice policies. Yeah.
And I think, yeah, I think it's really fascinating the way also. So I love that idea that these citizens are imagining 2060 and they come up with these very creative ideas when it comes to environmental policy and other policy. I think it's absolutely brilliant that a town like Yahaba has this sort of future strategy office. They're using future design. But what I've really noticed over the last couple of years following your work is the way that your methodology is spreading. It's not only being used in small towns like Yahaba, which has 27,000 people, but it's being used in larger cities and towns, Uji, in Kyoto and other places. And I understand it's also being used in Japan's Ministry of Finance, where they're having these sessions where they imagine themselves in 2060 getting dressed up or sometimes wearing a hat that says Homo Futurus. Why do you think your method is spreading? Why are these local government organizations taking this idea and working with it? What's the attraction to them?
One of the reasons is that Japanese population has been decreasing. The population has been declining. So the budget has been shrinking quite rapidly. Then they have to think about and how to allocate them. Of course, many people in the town and they don't want to. Their important things supposed to be reduced. The money is supposed to be reduced. They don't want to be reduced. Sooner or later, somebody has to cover the cost. Are there any nicer ways? So being imaginary future people means that once I become an imaginary future person, I'm supposed to think about current me and future me, right? And taking a look at both of them, slightly higher point of view, then they can create nicer social views. They understand that. That's the reason why they started employing our method.
One of the things I've read about with future. Sorry, go on, Sophie.
I was just going to say, I think, it's so fascinating because I suppose what our politicians often say is, well, we're acting in the way that people want us to act. They voted for our manifesto and they want us to deliver these things quickly. And so we're just guided by the people who want short-term thinking. But I think what your method demonstrates is, given the space, the time, the permission and I suppose the kind of the mandate to do that future thinking, politicians are wrongly placing people and citizens in a short-term thinking box. Do you think that's the case?
I don't know how to answer your question, but the important thing is that emergency politicians, they think about very they are very short-sighted and they think about they're supposed to take care of current generation. However, emergency politician can be imaginary future politician. Am I right? For example, G7 people. Once we do have some G7 meeting, G20 meeting, in the second day of the negotiation, everybody's supposed to be imaginary future prime minister, imaginary future president. They can talk about the current issue, becoming imaginary people. Once they create some nice policies, they're supposed to use that.
It's funny, actually. I mean, if I can just comment on that, personally, I don't have a lot of faith in those politicians at a G20 meeting, even if I think if they use their method, yes, maybe they might think more to the future and you got them dressed up. But I have a lot more faith in citizens to do this in a way than those major politicians, though I absolutely think it'd be worth doing those experiments. But one of the examples I found really interesting in your work, Yoshi, was the way that the town of Yahaba, through the future design method, that they agreed to pay higher water taxes in order to invest in the long-term water infrastructure of their town, which was for the benefit of their, their children or their grandchildren. Clearly, this method helped them do that. And as you were saying, Sophie, it's kind of, you're giving permission to people to go into the future. And that makes me think of a question for you, Sophie, really, which is, there's always this issue around money, really, tax. Groucho Marx famously said, why should I care about future generations? What have they ever done for me? So in your experience, Sophie, how do you convince current voters and current politicians that they should be maybe sometimes making sacrifices for future generations? Maybe they'll have to pay higher fuel taxes, or maybe use a different language. What's your way of helping them connect with that future?
Well, I mean, I think that, yes, it's always difficult, isn't it, when you're proposing new taxes. And in fact, one of the things that I'm proposing in my recently published Future Generations report is a new education tax in Wales, so that we can implement a brand new curriculum which really does focus on future-based skills in a holistic way, which focuses not just on the ability of young people to get jobs of the future, but to actually have lives well lived as well. And it's always difficult when you propose those new taxes. And likewise, even when you're working within existing budgets, shifting those budgets from short-term interventions. In Britain, we're passionate, in Wales as well, we're passionate about our National Health Service. But in actual fact, our National Health Service is a national illness service. It treats people when they're ill. It doesn't do very much at all to prevent people from becoming ill in the first place. And so I actually think that there are some areas where investing in better long-term ways can be right for both current and future generations. So if we think about the aging population, so by 2036, Wales will have double the number of over 65s. And those over 65s, depending on public policy to a large extent, depending on whether we focus on those longer term investments in tackling things like loneliness and isolation, getting up front of our obesity crisis, making sure that people and our planning system, the way in which we design and build communities, facilitate those healthy sort of choices and healthy behaviours. All of those sorts of things will be crucial as to whether those over 65s who are alive now, the Middle Ages, I'll be one of them, whether those over 65s are going to, have high demand and high care needs, or whether, as Mr. Spock says, they're going to live long and prosper. But doing those things will also be right for future generations. So I think that, the debate of, the interests of current and future generations being in conflict, yes, there are barriers, there are balances that have to take place and trade-offs and so on. But I think that there are a large number of policy areas where if we do the right thing, we can be getting things right for current and future generations. But that still takes a significant mindset shift amongst politicians in particular, perhaps less so with the electorate if we see that leadership from politicians.
Yeah, Yoshi, what do you think about that? What have you learned from future design about, the allocation of budgets through time, about, some of the issues around conflict or potential overlaps between the interests of current and future generations? Because I think that's a real sort of live issue, for people.
Yeah, and one thing, what we found is that emergency elderly people, do they think about, that sooner or later they're going to die? Can they think about the future very nicely? Or younger generation can see the future very nicely? And we found elderly people can see the future very nicely. That is amazing. That once they become imaginary future people, they can see the future very nicely. They think about the future. However, younger people, they cannot see the future very nicely. So elderly people have a very nice understanding of the future because they have been living, for example, 70 years, 80 years. This makes them to think about the future nicely. Sophie,
now, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just want to say that I was imagining if Greta Thunberg was on this call, and she might say, wait a minute, Are you telling me that older people are better at thinking long term than younger people? And she would say, no, wait a minute. It's all those older people who voted for Brexit, for example, because they weren't thinking about future generations. And it's the younger generation who are more committed, at least on ecological issues, to taking the long view. So are you saying something different from that?
Important thing is, once they become imaginary future people, so going to 2080, 2090, they can create so many nice ideas. So I just want to ask Sophie, and what about your experience? And I mean, the elderly people are so selfish.
I think, so we also have an older people's commissioner in Wales, and, we talk often about this need to not pitch one generation against another. And undoubtedly, there are significant issues, both for older people in terms of future trends and scenarios, so digital exclusion, the extent to which public services and all services are going online, and the extent to which older people are excluded, the extent to which if you lose your job in your 50s, you're much less likely to be able to re-enter the workforce than if you're younger. So there are challenges on both sides. Undoubtedly, however, this generation Z, are likely to fare much worse than their parents and their grandparents, I suppose, in terms of their ability to own a home, the economic costs of climate change, and so on and so on. But I think that, if we go down a dark path of pitching one generation against the other, it's the wrong approach. And what we should be doing, as I said earlier, is finding those things where there's mutual benefit. During the lockdown that we've all been part of in some shape or form, no matter where we live, people have been reconnecting with nature. They've been seeing the benefits that this brings to their physical and mental health now. They're reevaluating how they value those sorts of things, and enhancing and maintaining that and making sure that we don't destroy that for future generations is also important to our current generations being able to experience that. I mentioned the health service, a critical one in terms of getting that right for current and future generations. You often hear older generations talking about the old days when communities were connected, when people talked to each other, where people helped each other out. And our vision in Wales is for a Wales of cohesive communities, vibrant, well-connected, safe communities that people can live and work in. And when we see some of the things that have happened as a result of COVID, and indeed we have a different approach from our government in Wales, largely centred around the Future Generations Act. So we've had no messages in Wales about go back to the office. In fact, we're going the other way. Stay in your local community. And actually, we're going to invest in your local community, and we're going to help you to work from home. And some of the proposals that I'm putting forward as well are things like, let's think about a reduced working week and how that could benefit both generations. Because if people are working less, that's good for the current generations in terms of their physical and mental health. They could also be spending that time volunteering, looking after their neighbour, being part of that connected communities that the older generations often talk about and often want to go back to. But actually, it's equally important to our current generations, because we know in terms of loneliness and isolation, it's actually as much as a problem for this younger generation as it is for older generations. In some ways, they've never been more connected, but in other ways, they've never been less connected.
Can I just ask you, Sophie, actually, and maybe this is a question that Yoshi secretly wants to ask you. I think, some people might look at a Future Generations Commissioner and be critical of them. Like my kids, to be honest, said, why should I trust a Future Generations Commissioner with my future interests? I've got 11-year-old twins. And I was talking to my kids about that, and they said to me, couldn't you combine the future design approach with having a guardian, like a Future Generations Commissioner? Is it possible? I mean, I know you're aware of this issue, Sophie, and the need to involve communities, and have done enormous work around this. Is it possible to sort of formalize that by using this kind of future design citizen assembly method in some of your decision-making processes, or for other Future Generations Commissioners to do it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that that could probably develop some sort of, dream team infrastructure, a combination of the two. One of the things that I've been working on is I've established something called a Future Leaders Academy, which is made up of 20 future leaders from across Wales, aged 18 to 30, from a whole range of different backgrounds and sectors. And they've been through an intensive leadership program. In fact, I know you've you've contributed to their learning as well, Roman. And what they are now doing is they are actually mentoring current leaders. So you usually get it the other way around. The older people mentor the younger people because they've got more experience. But actually, there's a big challenge because the people who are sitting on our boards and taking those decisions do not really understand the interests of future generations. So we need to be talking to our future generations. And these future leaders are mentoring current chief executives of institutions across Wales. They're learning a huge amount. They've recently been part of advising the government on their COVID recovery strategy, so that they can get that input from younger generations. So I think there are a range of different initiatives, but I think something like the citizens' assemblies and like the work that Yoshi's doing, combined with a formal institution with statutory powers to speak out on behalf of future generations, would be incredibly powerful.
One of the things I've noticed, Yoshi, in Japan with your method is that you've been working formally with cities and with local governments, but if I understand it correctly, you've also started putting into practice what you call the fade away principle, which is the idea, as I understand it, that citizens themselves can organize their own future design sessions. They can take it into their own hands. And this seems to be in the same way that Sophie's trying to spread the future intergenerational justice gospel, I'd say, through the Future Generations Leadership Academy, for example, which I think is brilliant. In a way, you're doing something that allows it to spread potentially. So could you say something about how that has been developing, that fade away idea, and how communities can be empowered themselves to do this anywhere across the world?
Sure. And we are the people who are supposed to support people there. They are the people who are supposed to decide everything. So I mean that we usually provide some systems, the future design type of a system, them. They are the people who are supposed to use them. And sooner or later, they can understand our system. Then we are supposed to be fading away. So I mean that we are not the people who can provide some opinions or our policies. Of course, they want to get some specialists. We can invite some other specialists for them. And sooner or later, we are supposed to die away. That's our system.
And I love that idea.
Thanks a lot for this reflection. I would like to use the last 10 to 15 minutes to give the questions from our audience a little space. It seems to me that our audience is also thinking a lot about the relation between our current youth generations and future generations. Sophie, there's one question that is directed to you that goes like this. One participant asks, how is the work of the Welsh Future Commissioner rooted in and backed by the young generation? So how much do you talk to the young generation? How do you involve them in your work? And how is their response to what you do?
Well, it's very much rooted in dialogue with our future generations, although in Wales we also have a children's commissioner who is responsible for ensuring the rights and interests of children at the moment are enshrined in the way we go about doing business in Wales. But some of the things that I do, for example, is the Future Leaders Academy. We've also, so I've just published a manifesto for the future. Next year we have parliamentary elections in Wales, and that manifesto has been devised through dialogue with across the generations, but a group of young people have actually helped me to create a young person's version of that manifesto and are helping to promote that. Lots of dialogue with schools, colleges, and so on. And so we also have a youth parliament in Wales, which mirrors our national parliament. Parliament. So again, dialogue with those young parliamentarians who are elected. And then I suppose a really exciting development in Wales is that for the parliamentary elections in Wales next year, we will be lowering the voting age to age 16. And I think that that's likely to have a significant impact as well on the extent to which our politicians are taking into account the interests of younger generations.
That's really interesting, Sophie, because that goes right to our next question, which I think could go to all of you as well. And it is about youth vote. One of our participants asks, how come you did not strengthen the issue of giving electoral rights to today's youth, with which you do, Sophie? And continues, wouldn't that address the present bias effectively? In comparison to other structural redesign, it seems to need only low effort to adapt towards future needs. And if I may add to this, is 16 sort of the lowest we can go? And what about giving it to children too, like Roman did in his experiment? Yoshi, do you want to start?
Giving some power to vote for a younger generation. So we have been conducting some experiment that means giving younger generation voting right, even baby cannot vote. For this reason, the parents can vote. Is this effective? And we have been conducting some experiment, and our experimental results show that this is not so effective. Why? Elderly people thought about in the current form of the election, and elderly people thought about, are we supposed to vote for our grandchildren? They used to do that. However, once they understand that, baby had a voting right, we don't have to vote for our baby. For this reason, the system didn't work out well in our experiment. So that's our experience.
And can I
Roman,
say,
would you like to weigh in? Sure, go ahead.
I'm just going to say that, even though on the one hand, I gave my kids, and me and my partner gave my kids our votes in the election, personally, I don't have huge faith in the current electoral system to revive democracy, to bring back faith in political democratic processes, to challenge the rise of far-right populism. And although I am a supporter of lowering the voting age, I don't think that's going to make fundamental differences, partly because we've got the same media systems and things which can skew votes, skew the information that people get. And that's where, when I'm thinking about reviving democracy for the long term, I've got a lot more faith in those participatory processes like citizens' assemblies. And I would like to see more citizens' assemblies involve young people. I think kids probably from the age of 12 or 13 upwards could be involved in those assemblies and get informed by expert opinions, have discussions, get involved in debate. So that's where I would really like to see young people involved more in formal processes in the citizen assembly approach.
I think Roman raises a really good point there around our current democratic system, and I think we're taking this step in Wales, reducing the voting age to 16. I think in the future maybe that could go further, but I don't think that we should put all of our eggs in that basket. And there are so many other parts of our democracy and the way in which we go about decision making that desperately need reform. So, as an example, one of the things that I've challenged government on is when we're appointing to boards and decision-making forums, we ask for things like, do you have expertise in finance and governance and risk management? We should be asking, do you have expertise in understanding the interests of future generations, and including future generations in those decision-making forums? This afternoon, I'm going to a meeting, one of my regular meetings with our First Minister, with a young student, Bethan, who's I think watching in somewhere, and she's on work experience with me. She's going to be challenging the First Minister from her perspective on skills for the future and what the government are doing. So I think, it's within our power, those of us who hold positions already, to actually influence the way that the system works. And it doesn't always need, mass changes to law or any of those things. It just needs our current leadership to be committed to changing the system within their sphere of influence and power to ensure that the voice of future generations are heard.
Thanks, Sophie. Tatsuyoshi, I saw that you also wanted to weigh in on this. Please feel free.
Okay, and important thing is that current situation, younger generation people, they can talk to each other, for example, using SNS, means that they don't know how to talk to elderly people. So it means that once we conduct some future design session, and younger people thought about, are we supposed to talk to 60 years old people, 70 years old people? We don't know how to get any kind of new idea. However, once they started each other, they can create some new idea together. So it means that they need some experience in talking together between younger generation and elderly generation. So this is very important. And we have been forgetting about talking each other. So that's a very important thing for communication.
Mm-hmm. So the dialogue is important, but also the design of the process in which this dialogue takes place. I would like to pose one last question to all of you that's also from our audience. I mean, when thinking about sustainability and sort of the nearer term future of the next 10 to 15 years, one of the most important political projects are the Sustainable Development Goals. And one question from the audience is whether you think that in this very important political process that the future generations are considered sufficiently in the Sustainable Development Goals today. Who would like to start?
I'm happy to
Sophie?
start. Yeah. So our legislation takes the Sustainable Development Goals and I suppose makes them our own. So we have 7 national wellbeing goals in Wales. The definition of those goals relate back to all of the SDGs. I think in their construction and what they actually require, they are working in the interests of future generations. But the way in which we talk about our legislation is there's 2 tests, a double test. It's both what you do and then how you decide to do it. So as an example, we could, reduce our carbon emissions in transport by rolling out electric vehicles and investing all of our money in doing that. And if you want to reduce carbon emissions through transport, that would probably be a sensible thing to do. However, if you think about that holistically, thinking about what are the things that we should be doing, first of all, to balance current needs against future needs and take decisions in a way which meet today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own. Then if we balance that against our other goals, so our goals of improving the health of the nation, our goals of creating more cohesive communities, our goals of focusing on a low carbon and circular economy, actually an investment in electric vehicles is completely the wrong approach because it doesn't help to meet those other goals. So I think that where the Sustainable Development Goals perhaps could be improved is to have written large that principle as we have in Wales. You must implement these or take an approach to meeting these SDGs in a way which takes account of the needs of future generations, and they must be done holistically rather than chasing after just one short-term target, which often when you work it through is at the detriment of another goal.
Thanks a lot, Sophie. We don't have much time left, so I would like to ask you to keep it short, Tatsuyoshi and Roman, but please weigh in if you would like to on this last question. Tatsuyoshi, would you like to go first?
Okay, and sure. Okay, market and democracy, they don't have any eyes for the future. SDGs have been using these two systems. SDGs support to think about introducing some other new system to think about the future very nicely. So I think SDGs target are wonderful. However, introducing some other new system like a kind of future design into our social system is important. That's it.
Thanks. Roman?
Yeah, I'd say I find the SDGs far too conservative, really. I think they're still framed broadly in the language of growth. Maybe not regular economic growth, but sustainable growth and green growth and so on. And I think there is no systematic evidence that we can decarbonize and dematerialize our economies nearly fast enough to comply with the Paris Agreement and so on by growing, even with green growth, sustainable growth. I think we need new models. The SDGs needs to maybe go a bit further. And that's why I like Kate Raworth's donut economics model, which has the SDGs in the middle, which is getting us above a social foundation, bringing us above basic social needs, health, education, and so on, but staying within planetary boundaries, explicitly moving away from the language of growth. And I think the other thing that's missing in the SDGs is they've been too afraid to talk about the politics. And the politics is that we need to reinvent democratic institutions, what this whole session's been about. And the SDGs have just been too quiet on politics. And it's time for them in the next stage, I think, to think about changing the DNA of democracy. And I think we need to bring future generations into decision-making processes and not cross our fingers that having all those SDG goals is going to solve our problems for us. But I'm still glad that they exist.
Thanks a lot, Roman. I think this is a great closing remark, and maybe the COVID crisis will be this window of opportunity to change our institutions in a way that they give more regard to future generations. I want to ask everybody in the Zoom to take 2 minutes of your time to fill in the evaluation form, which helps us tremendously to get better for next year, but also for the next sessions and tomorrow. And I want to thank the three of you, Roman, Sophie, and Tatsuyoshi, for this great debate. It was really great having you, and I wish you all a good day. We will take a 15-minute break now here at Inocracy, and after that continue with our next session at 1:30 p.m. CET. And that will be our next vision sprint with Jeff Quasi-Klein and Kübra Gümüşay, where they will talk about how their everyday life could look like in the year 2035. So tune in and stay with us, and I wish you all a good break now. Bye-bye.